Talladega, Alabama, the world's fastest track. Paula Murphy has established a new women's closed course speed record at 172 miles an hour.
They were like, who the heck is this?
Just tell me again, who's Paula Murphy?
Today at Indianapolis, Paula Murphy becomes the first woman driver to pilot laps around the famed Brickyard.
It's terrible. I didn't know anything about Paula.
She sounds like one hell of a person. I wish I could accomplish that much stuff in my lifetime.
Women were not allowed. You couldn't even go in the pits or in the garage area, let alone get in one of their cars. I may have started a little something.
With the dawn of the 1960s, a fresh generation of heroes was reshaping America. A young president ushered in an era of innovation, challenging society to reach new heights, including the moon. Women bolstered by hope continue to fight for opportunities. On the motorsport scene, speed was king in an exclusive men's club. A gritty breed of race drivers pushed the limits of their machines. Names like Petty and Andretti transcended the racetrack. Emerging from their shadows was a lone woman, a natural, fearless. Her knack to set records in the broadest range of cars had her male peers asking, who's that? Her name is Paula Murphy, and she was undaunted.
This Southern California housewife leads a double life. Here she's Paula Murphy, who runs a suburban household that includes a teenage son.
She was mom to me. That's the way she acted. You go to school, clean up your room, all those kinds of things. But then she went off to go race, and then the flying housewife kind of came to be.
She prepares to sit down in the most unusual office ever occupied by a pretty young lass in a miniskirt.
If you believe the legend of Paula Murphy,
she was petite, but she had a big right foot.
You find this very good-looking woman that's Evel Knievel in her blood. Back then, I mean, you didn't live if you crashed. Paula just was a daredevil.
You call her a speed demon because she was a woman back in the day, in the 60s, when women didn't do that?
She was known for her smile, and that smile was almost a smirk because she knew that she was stepping into a space that maybe she wasn't welcome necessarily, but she also knew she was going to step into that space and create some waves.
This woman drove Indy cars. This woman's done Bonneville. She's done everything that I've dreamed of doing.
I have so much respect. Paula had a love and passion for driving and wanted to get behind the wheel of anything and everything that she could.
She broke down a lot of barriers and maybe wasn't given credit for the barriers that she broke down.
She probably is the most significant woman in racing history.
I call myself the fastest broad in the West.
The women's movement was regrouping in the early 60s. Social issues topped the list, and a group of female athletes set the tone for change.
When you think of what society was like in the 60s and in the 70s, women were going through a lot of chaotic times. We were fighting terribly for equal rights and to be able to get a credit card in our own names.
Too many times you were told, no, women don't do that.
They weren't given the opportunities, not even nearly as much as girls are given the opportunities now. They really pushed through it and did some great things, and especially with the resources that they had.
A lot of women stepped out of the, out from behind the shadows and started getting up in front of the cameras and playing and showing that they had the stuff to do it.
That was the tipping point. And the athletes and these sports stars are visible. And it's something that young women can point to.
And the fact that there were laws or rules that prohibited women from being in the space that they should have been there. I knew it existed, but I never knew how it changed.
Never entered my mind that I'd be a race car driver. Not in a million years. My dad never drove. One day I decided I'm going to drive my mother's car. And we were down at the Cleveland Yachting Club. And I told my mother I needed the keys to the car because I wanted to get a sweater. So she gave me the keys to the car, and off I went to the Ford, and I got in that thing, fired it up, put it in first gear, and off I went. My mother thought the car had been stolen. And of course, she called the police. And fortunately, I got back down before the police caught me.
Early bold moves defined Paula's life, first growing up sailing on Lake Erie, and later when her young family relocated to the West Coast. They settled in Southern California during the golden age of West Coast car culture, an atmosphere that ignited an unknown passion.
The early sports car races were delightful. It was a happening.
You had huge fields. I mean, the field would be 50 or 60 cars.
I had friends where I worked that were active in Sports Car Club of America. My friend said, you should come out to the races with us. I said, no, I don't think so. I'm not really interested. So finally, they taught me into going, and I watched, and I thought, this has got to be the most boring thing I've ever seen. It's like watching the grass grow. So then she said, oh, we have ladies' races. You should get somebody to give you a car to run in the ladies' races.
Sports car racing, even from the earliest days, have always been inclined to be more willing to experiment.
In the world of motorsport and hot rods, women were welcome. It was kind of West Coast central, but really in road racing, it was equal. Early on, they realized that women are every bit as talented as men, and if you have two very powerful cars, it's going to be a race.
I charmed this guy that had an Alpha and asked him, could I drive your car? And he said, sure. I was kind of shaky-limbed at the time, you know, getting in the car, and I thought, what am I really getting myself into? And I won my class, and I thought, shoot, I can do that. That was fun.
Her Alpha success created driving opportunities, but usually not with a consistent team or manufacturer. Undeterred, Paula adapted instantly. Her performance never wavered, a pattern that set the tone for her career. She found herself winning in a Ferrari and then Porsche, where she found a mentor and caught the attention of a racing icon.
Scooter Patrick, who sports car people know the name, he let me drive a modified Porsche. Then I did quite well. Needless to say, I won a few races with that car.
Scooter realized talent, raw talent. She didn't have telemetry in the car, so the crew didn't know what she was doing. They didn't know when she was putting the brakes on going into a corner. She had to feel that. He understood the benefits of having a woman racing on his team. And when he nodded and said, okay, we're going to let you try it and see what happens, that opened up everybody else's eyes.
In the 50s and 60s, there were pioneers of motorsport. And Shelby was right there on the top. Parnelli was a racer, then car builder. Roger Penske. I mean, these were amazingly talented men. Paula Murphy was right in the mix.
There was a lot of big boys sports car racing when I was. Carroll Shelby, Dan Gurney, Ken Miles. I went out to his school at Riverside, and I taught there at his school. I never felt any disrespect. I got accepted. And then one thing more led to another, finally leading to STP and Andy Granatelli.
Andy Granatelli was the most powerful person in motorsports. Catching his attention would change Paula's life. While mixing it up with the driving icons of the SoCal sports car scene, Paula Murphy garnered a reputation for grace under the pressure. There was no doubt she had talent, a rare combination of succeeding with no practice, no drama, and most importantly, no fear. Attributes that caught the attention of a marketing genius. The results of their partnership had unintended consequences, setting auto racing on a course for change.
I don't think a lot of people know about what Paula did in 1963.
By 1963, Paula was a regular on the LA sports pages, catching the eye of their auto industry expert, Bill Dredge. Bill had a lot of powerful friends, and when the most influential of them all, Andy Granatelli, called looking for a woman who could drive, Bill had one suggestion.
Bill Dredge was auto editor for the LA Times, and he did quite a story on me. And I think that's what turned Granatelli on.
He was the smartest guy I've ever seen, and being able to take no matter what happened and put it in the headlines.
Bill Dredge worked hand in hand with Andy, and between the two of them, they came up with ideas that no one would ever have thought of.
Dating back to Depression-era Chicago, Granatelli and his brothers Joe and Vince carved a reputation as speed legends. From their invention of the Paxton supercharger to their brash approach to the Indianapolis 500, they were legends.
Andy Granatelli was a hero of the hot rodders in the 50s and the late 40s.
Andy was a daredevil on the track and in business. By 1963, no one was more powerful in motorsports than Andy Granatelli.
A lot of people forget that Andy was a driver before he was this big promoter, you know. Well, he decided he had more talent and more ability to make things happen when he stepped out of the car.
And he wasn't afraid to try anything, whether it was put a woman in a car or put a JATO rocket on the back or do turbine cars at Indy. You know, he thought way out of the box. And then, of course, STP, he made that company famous.
Most of the drivers here at the 500 use STP oil treatment. It's the best method known of cutting friction.
Have your service station crew add STP to your oil.
Whether in ads or on the grid, Andy emboldened his brand.
He would go where there was a race or somewhere and just hand out STP stickers left and right.
Every little kid had an STP sticker on their skateboard or their bicycle or whatever. Andy Granatelli took racing to the American people.
Andy's influence knew no boundaries, from sports royalty to motorsports.
There's Roger Penske, there's the France family, there's the Holman George family. Andy was bigger than all of it.
By the 1950s, Studebaker was starting to struggle. The realities of the harsh nature of the automotive marketplace is coming home to roost. And by 1960, it looks like Studebaker's going to exit the automobile market. And that's when a new president came on board, Mr. Sherwood Egbert. Egbert came in, looked around, and said what the company has is an image problem. And late 1950s, 1960s, a horsepower race is gearing up, and he wanted to be a part of that. And the best way to do that was hire Andy Granatelli to try and spruce up Studebaker's product line.
Andy Granatelli was more famous than Mario Andretti. Andy Granatelli was more famous than Richard Petty.
When he hired me, he said, if you stay with me, I'll make you as famous as I am.
And he wasn't kidding. He was that big of a personality.
It's, you know, Reggie Jackson going to the Yankees in the 1970s. It's that level of, you know, attention of media that comes with it. And it was an inspired choice, and, you know, certainly Studebaker history is much richer for it.
Like a wrestler does his deal, when Andy was the man, it was just different than anybody else done it. People paid attention.
Speed and performance sold cars. Brands staked their sales on those headlines. Andy was no stranger to setting records and had a plan to save Studebaker.
The fact that Andy knew that Studebaker was a little bit failing, Andy required some kind of special thought.
Bonneville is right up there with like Le Mans or Indianapolis. It's kind of one of those mystical, like one name things where everyone instantly recognizes it. It has that gravitas.
Bonneville was this perfect speed laboratory.
They're looking for how are we going to maximize our exposure, what's going to garner the most attention. And putting two females, skilled drivers in the car at the time is going to generate a whole nother set of stories.
If you wanted women to buy Studebakers, then you needed women to drive them.
Any driver could probably do it, but women. And then, of course, that marketing head of his, the racing housewives. Now, how many racing housewives did we have in the early 1960s? Lucille Ball was not one of them.
Paula was brave. She took all instructions very well, very photogenic. She worked hard. She drove hard.
We went to Bonneville in 1963 with 12 stock Studebakers. And we set about 365 USAC stock car records. Everything from a little 6-cylinder Studebaker Lark up to the Studebaker Avanti, which I had the very great fortune of driving to set my first women's land speed record.
And at one time, we'd be running 8-10 cars at once, and Paula Murphy would be driving one, and my brothers would be driving one, I would be driving one. We'd all set these different records.
It was genius to bring a woman, and Paula was a very good-looking woman.
It was incredulous that this gorgeous, lovely, well-spoken woman could go out there and pound the pants off a speed record.
Paula was the star.
Surrounded by a group of Los Angeles well-wishers, Miss Paula Murphy are ready with their Avanti to take off in an attempt to establish a new cross-country record to New York City.
Studebaker made the most of that, and it really helped to propel Paula's career to much further heights.
From the salt flats to cross-country runs, Paula proved worthy of any challenge. Immediately, she earned her place in an elite stable of drivers.
She was a natural. The flying housewife kind of went away, but Miss STP, that one stuck.
She was actually one of the first race car drivers I knew as a kid, because the first big thing that STP did was that Bonneville run. So the first pictures I'm seeing of racing as a young kid is Paula Murphy.
Everybody knew the name, Annie Granatelli, STP. I was driving a truck. I went into this place, STP, and there was pictures all over the wall that I saw a woman on the wall. Paula was there. That was the lady on the wall.
Promoting and befriending Paula was right in line with his line of thinking.
It might be outside of the box, but sometimes you got to do things a little differently. For him to support her like that, as long as the performance is there, you know, why not?
Paula was quick, and she was a winner, and she was well known. He knew what he was doing.
From a business standpoint, he was probably, in his mind, doing something that was not only good for STP, but was also good for women, because he was doing it at a time when women were being more suppressed and more held back. And, you know, he's showing, hey, look at what this gal can do.
By the end of 1963, Paula was entrenched in the powerhouse STP lineup of drivers, with names like Parnelli Jones, Mario Andretti, and eventually Richard Petty, the only woman driver with consistent corporate and marketing support.
We were like the Cincinnati Reds. When in their heydays, they were called the Big Red Machine. And I think STP, earned that name.
It lasted so long, it's still here. Nobody will ever overcome what Andy and the STP brand meant to racing.
When you look at the overall of all the things that STP was doing, you know, especially with IndyCar and getting into stock car racing, she's rubbing elbows with Richard Petty and Mario Andretti, and blows me away sometimes just thinking about it.
Paula Murphy's Bonneville records and racing exploits were grabbing headlines and labeled unconventional for the time. But the big motorsport stages like Daytona and Indy were still considered off limits for women, including Paula. It would take the horsepower of Andy Granatelli combined with Paula's icy steel to shatter old myths.
I got credit for being the first woman allowed on the Speedway in a race car. If it inspired other women, great. But I don't know how many women knew this.
It's terrible. I didn't know anything about Paula when I was here.
It's unfortunate that it didn't get maybe more play or more knowledge about it, shared, because that could have maybe made a bigger difference.
Driving at Indianapolis was and is the ultimate for any race car driver.
Driving at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway in the 60s was a difficult task, but in these massively high horsepower cars that are super fast down the straightaway, but then you had to get heavy on the brakes to make sure you could navigate through the corners, they were cars that you had to manhandle.
And then the Novi was even more temperamental.
The legend of the Novi remains in the soul of hardcore Indy loyalists, but even for champion drivers, it was a beast to handle.
For Paula to drive that car, I love racing and I've driven a little myself, but to drive those cars, I wouldn't get in it.
Women, you couldn't even go in the pits or in the garage area, let alone get in one of their cars.
I can't imagine how strange that must have been and how overwhelming she must have felt.
There's a story of, even having a woman sit in your race car thought to be bad luck. A Studebaker driver quit right before the race because someone's girlfriend had sat in his car he was going to drive at the 500 that year.
Well, they all said that I'd have trouble shifting it. I didn't, and it was only 1, 2. It was simple, and then step down on the pedal.
They thought that it was a joke.
They were apparently betting that she wouldn't be able to get it without stalling it.
It's 4 laps. She knew that was it. That was all she was going to get. It's insane. They didn't realize this woman had that talent and that bravery that any one of those men had, if not more. You know how long it would take a Formula One champion to come over and get up to speed at Indianapolis? Paula hopped in the car and was up to speed immediately.
I don't think anybody back then understood the ramifications of what it would mean in the future.
It had to have been so jarring for people. There was really a very specific role that women were seen to be in. And so all of a sudden, this juxtaposition of seeing a woman behind the wheel of a race car, let alone at Indianapolis Motor Speedway, but it also shows you what the context was of why people were not as welcoming as they could have been. If you really put it in, that women were meant to be at home at that point. They weren't really meant to be getting, grease in their hair and grease under their fingernails. So when you put it all in context, it was really probably the last thing that anybody expected.
It was a promotion for Andy, but maybe for the Holmans, it was like, are you really going to bring a gal in here to drive in this men's arena?
I mean, who puts a woman in a Novi and runs around Indianapolis? Could anyone else have done that except Andy Granatelli? And would any other woman have been willing to get behind the wheel?
During her 4 laps, Paula hit speeds of 160 miles per hour, comparable to the elite male drivers of the time. The ramifications of those laps continue to echo through the generations, from Janet Guthrie to Lynn St. James to Sarah Fisher, Danica Patrick, and current women racers at the Brickyard.
Anytime that you see shifts in progress, you can usually trace a direct line to whoever opened the door. And in this case, it was Andy Granatelli. I'm sure that he also was smart enough at the time to know that if it didn't go well, it was going to reflect poorly on women, reflect poorly on the Speedway, reflect poorly on auto racing. So this was not only a bold decision, but I guarantee it was a well thought out decision. And Paula was a perfect choice.
She was a gutsy gal, and so she did it. The worst thing that could happen is that she would have crashed. That could have devastated not only her, it could have set all of us back.
That's important in the women that followed her because each step progressively got better and less boxes had to be checked. I, for one, definitely benefited from that directly.
She didn't have the ability to come up through these feeder series and get to this level. She came from driving a little sports car over here to driving a Novi at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. It's got to be the steepest learning curve in history.
We need to keep being visible and helping each other and make sure that although there might have been a gap, that we actually now redraw that through line from the very beginning of the Speedway to wherever we go 50 years from now, and Paula Murphy is one of those stops along the way.
Looking back at it now, you think, well, if I did it, some other woman's going to come along and do the same thing, and probably a heck of a lot better than I ever could. And they did.
Setting records put Paula in a media spotlight. She became an influential spokeswoman and go-to interview.
When you open the hood of your car, you should be familiar with these key parts.
Paula was the perfect subject for automotive writers, and many times her sharp wit provided the spark for a headline.
They would come up with this wild stuff, sometimes for their own self-aggrandizement so that their byline would show up on page 1.
Most of the media didn't know how to write about race car drivers because they couldn't figure us out. And when you're female on top of it, the only thing they could write about was the female part of it. She was kind of fighting a double whammy of discrimination. If you don't know what else to write other than she went fast, then the other thing is, what did she wear?
Propelled by a swath of media interest, Paula headed back to Bonneville. It would be another unheard of first for a woman. This time, she'd pilot a jet car, and the writers anointed her with a new nickname.
Yeah, fastest woman on wheels. That was a big deal, especially during the jet car time.
They called me and said, hey, you want to go faster and come up to Bonneville?
Putting a woman in a jet car, no one had done that. Andy used Walt Arfons and Goodyear as a mechanism by which to get the press. I think he was impressed that she was able to do as well as she did.
They had the stuffed pillows behind my back because I couldn't reach the pedals, so I'm up there flapping in the breeze, not hiding down behind the big windshield.
The fact that she could go 250 miles an hour in about 4 inches of water, I would almost bet you there was some butt puckering going on when she was in that car.
Miss Paula Murphy about to warm up the rubber of her rear tires with a burnout.
Once we went drag racing, it was a much more serious thing. It was a dangerous thing. Every time she left the start line in the funny car, I always put my hand on the back of the car. That was 6 seconds of pure terror for me.
It goes to the point of women doing things outside of what the culture said. And the hot rodding community was first and foremost in that.
Getting women in racing to drive, that was a fight, but drag racing opened that door.
Fate played a hand when Paula crossed paths with the gruff mechanic, Fat Jack Bynum. They decided to form a team. It was the NHRA's odd couple, but the dynamic worked.
We were small teams, all of us in the beginning. Like, I only had one mechanic that went with me, and my son, when school was out.
It was definitely at first a novelty act, if you will, because the car at the time wasn't the quickest and fastest thing out there. Once we got into a little more state-of-the-art rig, then she was all of a sudden competitive.
I would do match races. Just one other car or a 4-car team, or sometimes a 6-car show, sometimes an 8-car show. And we got paid if we made all 3 runs. If you only made 1 run, you could hardly make it home.
No other woman had driven anything like that, not on nitro anyway. And so she went to go get licensed.
The NHRA required all drivers in their top levels to be licensed to compete. No woman had ever been licensed. Paula invoked change, but it wasn't easy.
The newcomers had to make 3 runs in front of the drivers in the class that you were racing in, and 3 drivers had to sign off on your license that you were capable of driving the car.
To get the license was extremely hard. They had a big criteria for it. They didn't want just anybody to get a license, and so you had to prove yourself, and that made it more difficult for the women.
You know, you had to make 3 passes for 3 weekends. You know, it didn't happen overnight. And they scoped you out. If they liked what you did, then you got your license.
She was good on starting line, had good reflexes. I don't remember ever seeing her get out of shape.
She went out and did the test runs, and everything went well. NHRA gave her license.
When she got that again was a big fight.
And then they pretty much turned right around and said, no, we have a problem, what if you crash?
NHRA felt it was an unsafe category for a woman to be competing in. Those were the exact words. I was amazed. I thought, how dare you? I got this all pat down, and now you're taking my livelihood away from me? Unsafe category for a woman. Now, why isn't it unsafe for a man? What's the difference?
It was a legal battle behind the scenes of great consequence between the National Hot Rod Association and STP.
And finally, Granatelli says, I'm pulling all my contingency money from your meets. So phew, I got my license back.
Now the first licensed female funny car driver, she was free to go head-to-head with superstars like Jungle Jim Lieberman and champion Don Schumacher.
Well, we came over from the United States to race at Stanapod, and I have a funny car, Plymouth Duster replica.
It was all okay, if she was out there running and, they were beating her. But then when things started to get a little more competitive, they didn't quite take it the same way anymore.
It was one thing if Joe beat Tom, but if Louise beat Tom, they were the laughingstock of the entire community. Because it wasn't just one racer against another. It was, you got beat by a girl.
The general public just ate it up, though. They just ate it up. And especially when she outran one of the big guys. Because it was an underdog type thing, A woman wasn't supposed to be winning these races, It was a man's sport.
It's a bad thing to say, but they thought women were inferior to men. I mean, they really believed that. They were old-time guys. They didn't realize that a woman could be the NHRA champion.
Paula had now proven women could compete at Indianapolis, on salt, and at the drag strip. But there was another racing series to conquer. NASCAR hadn't seen a woman set a speed record since 1956 on Daytona Beach. No woman had driven on the new high-bank super speedways of the era. Granatelli saw another opportunity to make some news, so she headed to Talladega, Alabama.
Talladega is huge. It's just wide and long, and it's very hard to get a feel for the track.
It was a wide open racetrack, had enough banking. If the car would run 200 mile an hour or 250 mile an hour, you could run wide open all around the track.
Bill France saw the opportunity as a way of promoting for NASCAR or women in racing.
That was the first when she did that in '71. If Paula would have showed up to the Daytona 500, they wouldn't have allowed her in the garage area, and she's out there driving the car.
1965 Daytona 500 winner Fred Lorenzen provided the vehicle, but perhaps with a little trepidation.
Freddie Lorenzen, Mr. Big Shot, he wasn't happy about that. Wouldn't come up to the car, wouldn't help me get in, wouldn't help me harness up.
I don't think he was too thrilled about the idea. Yeah, I think he was a little more old school.
Guys automatically have this sort of level of respect with each other, and you don't have that when you're a girl.
I got a little carried away with the loud pedal, and I kind of did almost a burnout, but the car got a little, and almost ran into a wall. And I thought, oops, you don't ever want to do that again. I had no idea how fast I was going, but I knew I was, doing pretty good.
When you think back in perspective, she went 170 some miles an hour. Hell, guys qualified at that speed in a car that wasn't even set up for the racetrack.
I like to think that more women maybe took notice of it or heard about it. I'm certainly within the NASCAR community. There must have been some other people talking about it.
Through the cavalcade of cars, terrains, and record speeds, there were mechanical failures and near misses, but Paula came through unscathed. She made it look easy, but the danger was real. And then her luck ran out when she went to Sears Point Dragway in 1973.
She never flinched getting into the car. I think she kind of had a, well, that's not going to happen to me. Oddly enough, it really didn't. The rocket car crash was the only time that it really happened to her.
I had seen the car run before at a drag strip, and I thought, do I really want to get in that thing? And I thought, oh, well, why not? Give it a try. But it was disastrous.
She had, up until that point, really not had any serious issues. And for the most part, she trusted the guy that was building the car.
Those things went from 0 to infinity in like nothing flat. You could literally take one of those things and make it run way faster than what the tracks could handle anywhere. They were just super quick, and there was not much reaction time. There was certainly the safety stuff aspect hadn't caught up to that kind of speed.
It was a scary looking thing, and with this big tank in the back, and it was charged up with liquid nitrogen, and it was silent until you stepped down the pedal, and there was a big whoosh.
They were running, 4-second ETs, 300 plus mile an hour regularly with that car. There was no time for any kind of a problem. The least little thing, and you were off the end.
When you lifted your foot off the throttle, that was supposed to have been a shutoff valve. That never worked. It kept going until it ran out of fuel.
The fact that she could not shut the thing off, which meant it went hurtling off the end of the drag strip, is not on Paula Murphy.
And went about 70, 75 feet in the air, body pieces falling off all over the place. And then fortunately, I didn't roll. I did endos and wrapped that baby right up. I was sort of half knocked out, and the first thing I remember was a security crew down at the end were running over, get out of the car, there's a fire. I really hurt my neck. So they heisted me out of the car and put me in the ambulance and took me off to the hospital. But stop and get my ET ticket. I want to know how fast I went.
She had a big gnarly mark on her helmet where I believe one of the front wheels came off and hit her in the head. That's probably what broke her neck.
Well, I was in a body cast from the top of my head to my hips for about 4 months. It was a bad move, bad move.
She's lucky to be alive.
Paula faced a long recovery, but slowing down wasn't her style. Her next act sealed her legacy. Paula's grueling recovery from her crash at Sears Point slowed her down, but didn't end her career. The tragedy motivated her to come back focused on setting new records. By spring 1974, an unexpected offer found her packing for Monaco. She grabbed her helmet, ready to race with a shocking chance to break new ground.
Who didn't want to go to Monaco?
This is Monaco, the proud principality on the shores of the Mediterranean. Monaco, a beautiful place to come to.
Monaco is one of the most important races in the world. Everyone wants to win it. Just even being part of that weekend, it's the most spectacular, magical celebration of racing.
Ever sat in a race car in their life? It's a thing that anybody would look forward to. I was delighted to be the only American picked.
Representing the United States in the historic first women's Grand Prix race in Monaco put Paula in some elite company.
The fact that Renault felt that it important to have a women's race as part of the activity of the weekend says a lot about how they valued it. To choose somebody to represent your country in an international competition, you're going to only choose the best of the best. And the fact that Paula was on the top of that list, and she's just coming off of an injury, says a lot about her. How many Americans have raced at Monaco in any context? I mean, Mario Andretti, Dan Gurney, and Paula Murphy.
5 years after her run in Fred Lorenzen's car, Paula was still the lone woman to set speed on the high banks of Talladega Superspeedway. Frustrated that she could go faster, she wanted another run. Her patience paid off. The pressure was enormous as she climbed behind the wheel of the famous 43 of Richard Petty, the king of stock car racing.
Perhaps the most famous woman driver in the history of motorsport, Paula Murphy, will be running for the world's women closed course speed record, which now stands at 171 miles per hour, Paula?
That's right, Ken.
When was that established?
I did that in 1971 in the STP Plymouth that Freddie Lorenzen drove that year in the race.
Back then, even more so, it's, haha, let's watch her fail.
In 1976, women weren't even allowed into the pit lane, and she's out there driving the car.
It wasn't about, this is a super talented race car driver. They were separating out gender and not giving credit to where credit was due. I can't even imagine.
How fast do you think you can go at Talladega? Any idea at all? Do you think you can crack 180?
Well, the car has the unlimited carburetor and big motor. So as I say, it's just how much nerve I am. I hope to go maybe 180.
Richard Petty, if he really didn't want me in that car, it never would have happened.
Richard seemed to be a little more welcoming to the deal.
The Pettys were a different breed. Remember, Richard's mother ran the operation. Linda Petty was involved. So they were used to women in power.
He agreed to let me drive his car, which, I have to hand it to him. To offer somebody that he hardly knew, a woman, his race car, his livelihood, now that's a guy.
They only had 2 cars. The second car was the car from the year before. The car probably came straight from like a Martinsville or something, a short track, and then they just threw her in it on the track.
I hit a little wet spot, and I kind of went, a little bit of it. I'm whoopsie-doo.
There was weepers on the track, and she said, they didn't tell me about that. It got all sideways, and she giggles about that.
Now, this is a seat for Richard. I get in the car, I'm going around, and I finally got to turn 1, and here my elbow got caught, and I couldn't, I only had one hand to steer the thing, because the seat was so tight. So I had to come in, and they took their foot and pushed the seat out a little bit. Only you, Paula, could get your elbow caught in the seat.
Think of it, Paula was probably 100 pounds to handle that car with no power steering, and of course, not even set up for the track. I mean, it was pretty amazing.
Paula Murphy has established a new women's closed course speed record at 172 miles an hour.
Not only did she break her speed record, Paula got some extra track time, a secret she kept for years.
They were like, who the heck is this? I got to go out with them when they were practicing in Richard's car, and I passed a couple of them. I guess they all got all upset on the outside. I said, well, you're holding me back, guys. I'm coming through.
Some of her lap times were just as good as any of the men, and I think she liked to have mixed it up with the men.
That's the biggest and hardest challenge as a girl in racing you will have, is earning the respect of guys. It's just hard, whether young, old. Young guys don't want to get beat by a young girl, Older guys do not want to get beat by a young girl.
To be able to excel or just, be able to hop in a car and make it go fast, whatever type it was, you've got a real talent there.
At the time, I guess I thought he's being really benevolent with a possibility of publicity.
It was a closed circuit, so closed circuit meant more to the general public than running straight on the salt flat. So they got a lot more publicity out of doing something at Talladega than what they would get at the salt flat.
The thrill of Talladega led to another bicentennial first, as Paula partnered with Indy 500 champ Johnny Parsons to drive around the world, an American woman showcasing an independent spirit.
Driving around the world was the greatest experience I ever had, and how we pulled it all off, it amazes me.
She loved that. They went everywhere. Places like Iran and Afghanistan, and I think that put a cap on the whole thing.
In 1976, there were places where women couldn't drive. There were certainly also places where Americans weren't necessarily welcome with open arms. So that is a different level of bravery. If you stop and think about it, was kind of at play. So not only is she a confident driver, but she certainly is bold.
To this day, only a few drivers have matched the versatility of Paula Murphy.
How can you accomplish what Paula Murphy did in that time to race in all those different categories? That is unheard of. That is unheard of by a man, let alone by a woman.
If she was been in her prime today, Rick Hendrick be after her, Penske be after her. I mean, she would be picking where she would go.
We're 6 years after the fact, and we're still talking about this. This is a groundbreaking achievement. This is not just a footnote in history.
To see what she had done and all of the women that were here before myself, it adds to the story, and it makes it possible for girls in the future to not be considered the storyline, to be considered a part of the field instead.
I think she genuinely loved the sport and competed in something she was really good at and let the cards fall.
What I love about her was just that spirit of, I'm as good as everybody else. Give me the opportunity and I'm gonna go prove it.
She wasn't just a woman, she was a record-setting race car driver. And there was no taking that away from Paula. She created not only a path forward for women, but it was a path that anyone would be honored to walk.
And why do they not remember Paula? She couldn't finish it out. It's just amazing what she accomplished, but we took it for granted, I'd say, at the time.
The reality is Paula Murphy had a lot more chapters to her story, and we didn't get the opportunity to read them. And I think we all have an obligation to keep going and kind of keep moving that story forward, because I don't want our efforts to be forgotten.
I'm proud of her. I can't say it any other way. She did a lot of stuff that other women never even had a chance to do.
Paula Murphy really was the first. She opened the door for everybody. She probably could have been the best of all of them.
Paula remained undaunted through her incredible 15-year career. Her ability to grab the wheel of any vehicle and go fast created headlines that changed motorsports. The public now accepted women could handle the top speeds of a race car. This time, it wouldn't take 10 more years for a female to get another chance. Paula's triumphant laps at Talladega paid off when less than a year later, Janet Guthrie qualified for the 1977 Daytona 500 and that May, the Indianapolis 500. Every time a woman straps in a race car, Paula's legacy continues and assures that she is not left behind.